Welcome, everyone. My name is Martin Rojas. I am a UI architect with Play on Sports. And today I wanted to just kind of talk about, AI and ChatGPT and how you can use that in your daily life. I know there's been a lot of different AI talks and everything. This one is going to be a mixture of applying it and what you need to do from a technical implementation into your own projects, but also about what you need to understand kind of from a mental model in using ChatGPT specifically, right? And the ChatGPT API as a developer. So has anybody here, just by a show of hands, have used the OpenAI API at all? Okay, we got a few, but now and there. So before we get into that, I just quick rundown. I think we've heard it multiple times, so I'm just going to speed through it. But AI, we heard it from the talks morning. I don't think I'm going to do a better perspective of it. But when we hear AI, it's literally the same way as when we've been hearing people say the cloud. It is a giant thing. It is it says a lot, but it doesn't say anything at all, right? There are, there's narrow, general, it's a whole field in computer science, and in ChatGPT, it really falls under narrow AI. So you have narrow, general, and super intelligent. We're nowhere near super intelligent. We are not even in general. We're still in narrow, meaning we can train it to do specific tasks at each one of them. So just to kind of give you a gauge on where we are on the AI spectrum based on computer science, we're narrow. ChatGPT is considered, machine learning, is deep learning, and it's just a natural language processor. It's nothing more than that. If you want to kind of deep down and look at probably one of the best articles at the kind of technology and kind of deep down of what GPT does, generative pre-trained transformer, what it does and what it's doing. Stephen Wolfram wrote a great article. It's very easy to read. You don't need to know it, and he kind of goes through it. And what it boils down to, it is a really fancy autofill. It is a great math. Google created a math called transformers, and it unlocked a new way of training data that what essentially it does is that it figures out the best probability for the next word. And from there, it just figures out what is the best, the next word, what should be the best probable. And it builds up into it, and eventually it comes out with the best answers. The more you train it, the bigger you make the model, the better the answers you get. And that's at a really high level, taking a lot of yes buts. That's really what ChatGPT, all these BARD, all of them are really doing. They are going through it at every time, based on all these words I put up so far, what is the next best word that fills in here, and just keeps guessing. And as developers, we know that if you keep building the next best little module, when you step back, you've built something really powerful. Before we get into that, and just to kind of, I'm not sure how many of you have ever heard, just by show of hands, have ever heard of the Chinese room thought experiment. It's from computer science. It was a thought experiment from the 80s, and it was a way to think about AI, and essentially, it was if you have a room where you were able to put in something with some characters that the person inside was not able to understand or get any meaning from it, but they had a set of rules that if they followed those rules to the letter, what came out of it made sense to the person outside of it, and to the point that they could have an entire conversation or they could answer any question that they had. Was that intelligence or was that not? That's really what we have with these new language models. There's not with all these thought experiences, there's not really a way to There's not really a clear answer. There's not there's not a pro or con. It's just a way to kind of start a conversation and kind of for you to have a way to have a conversation without getting stuck in any of the technologies or any of it, and really think about, like, if you're going to have any of these AI models make decisions on people's lives or things like that, realize that there is no understanding. It is just following models. It is autofilling the best probability of the next word. So you kind of, as a developer, I think there's a responsibility in knowing what you should be having these models do and not do. And that's just a little bit of a soapbox that I wanted to kind of cover, because I think for us, there's a bit of a responsibility of what these are capable of doing and realizing what they can and can't do. But now to getting into what we actually wanted to talk about here, you do. ChatGPT, and particularly the OpenAI API, what really sets it apart from everything else that's been done so far, from all the other AI models, machine learning models that have happened so far, is that we're not having to train any sets. You're not having to go out and find millions of images to create your own data set. You're not having to go and find out, spend thousands of dollars of resources. It is done for you. It is a REST point, it's a REST endpoint. If you have made that and you've making any kind of web application, you can add AI to your application. It is essentially that simple. It essentially all comes down to, if you can understand the kind of the way of thinking that you need around it, and how to apply like some of the very basic models around it, very basic models of how to use this API, you can do almost anything with it. And as they keep adding more and more capabilities, it becomes more and more powerful. Go into it. So the concepts, essentially, it is three. As we had mentioned before, the autofill, it is the tokens. So for example, a word like ChatGPT is amazing. It gets broken down into Chad is amazing and then the period. And what is that doing is that is how it is breaking it down to analyze what you are giving it. And it is also how it is generating the response. And that is how it counts what it charges you and everything, but that is literally what is generating that one time. And if you're using their the ChatGPT, the paid service, and you see that like blinking generation at a time, that is not a fancy animation they're adding. It is literally just streaming the response as it is coming at a time. It takes that long to generate the response, and it is literally just generating that next token one at a time. It's just looking at all the response and generating the next token. And then based on all that, generating the next token, and so on and so forth. The temperature is sort of the randomness or the BS. As we saw from the beginning, it knows that what is the best probability for that next word. Well, if you go with the perfect next word, it's kind of dry, it's a computer. So what has been found out with the math from a transformer is that if you just add a randomness number, pseudo-random, it makes it look more creative. So if the best number was learned, the best response was learned, but if you throw in a randomness of 5 instead of 2, and suddenly it's creative, then the response ends up becoming something a lot more human sounding. But all it is it's a randomness or kind of a BS meter. And you can play with it, and some responses work well with it, and that's what when you're creating your own version, your own use of the API, some responses will have higher temperatures, lower temperatures, and you just kind of work with it and see what the response to the particular use of it, which one works for your application. Some of it you may need more of this. And if you have questions at any point, please raise your hand and ask me. So if there's anything that I'm not being clear on. And then the third part of the REST call, essentially, is the query. And this is what goes back to the API. The API and the the model has no memory at all whatsoever. So every time you make a call, you have to send in your entire history. And you send in the messages that you're sending in messages marked in two versions. You have the parts that are the system, and this is the part that the end user never sees. This is where you tell it, you give it sort of some context. This is where you tell it what kind of personality you want it to give. This is where you tell it, like, hey, I want you to be act like a teacher. I want you to act like this. I want you to act like Sylvester Stallone. I want you to respond with like a party planner. I want you to be a study buddy. And same thing, you give it some samples of, like, if you get asked this type of question, I want you to answer like this. If you get asked a question about this topic, I just want you to not answer. So these go as part of the query, and this is the system. This is what we as developers create, and we give it that context. That's what's kind of one of the things referred to as context. And then the user, that is the conversation that the end user sees, the part of the chatbot, that conversation goes back and forth. But that is entirely dependent on us as the developers to send it back and forth every time. So if I'm having a conversation, I have to keep the state and I have to send it. Now, we're being charged on that entire thing every time. It has to be processed every time. What that opens that up to is that we can we don't have to start off from nothing every time. We can kind of pre-create in our application, simulate like a conversation at different stages. We can start off, if we're pre-training, we can almost create like a conversation and some sample responses, and it will analyze that and just create the best next response. It's an autofill, right? It'll figure out, it'll find the best response to wherever it is. The API is called is completion. So it'll just complete where you send it, the next best response to that. And that, now you start seeing how that really opens up a way that you can kind of see it. And this is what's happening on the back end. It's not necessarily what the interface is for the user. You can have a lot of buttons, and you're crafting some text, you're crafting a series of messages you're going to send to the ChatGPT API, and it's going to take all that and it's going to give you a text response. In that text response, one of the things is make it really easy, and what I've tended to do personally is that my first things that I use in system is that I tell it, like, any response you send, use Markdown, because that's suddenly a formatting language that's just entirely string-based, and all my responses are auto-formatted that I don't have to worry about, and I just pass on straight into the HTML and my response is formatted. Now, to the bit of the actual code, if you go here, this is there's a GitHub repo, but if you're in the computer, I also have a bit of a demo that we'll go through at the end of actually seeing how all these concepts kind of come together in there. So two things, the QR code is for the GitHub repo. You're gonna have it also later on, but just chat at my name, Rojas.dev. If you want to play around with the demo, we can play it later. But the front end, you just have whatever application you're using, and then the one thing that you need to tie into the OpenAI API is you need to have a REST endpoint in your backend that will take in your call and will make a call to their API. That is it, and it's essentially, once you've built one, and it can be very generic, you can use it for any number of projects, and that's essentially what that is. It can be a Lambda, or you can have it on a constantly running thing, and I've broken it down here into kind of the main things that you can do. This is just it's in Svelte, but it's a Lambda. So we'll go through it. Really simple. Here I'm getting a post request. I'm making sure I have my secret key, and then when I get my JSON, I'm just making sure I have the system prompts, the message prompts, and if I don't, I throw back an error. Nothing more complicated than that. Then with those two, I have to go through it and I have to make sure that I use the library to make sure I count the tokens. Now, each model, if you look at it, they have a max number of tokens that they can handle. That goes along with the price of the tokens. For example, for 3.5, it's about two tenths of a penny for every 1,000 tokens. Really, really simple. For ChatGPT 4, it's 4 pennies for 1,000 tokens. ChatGPT 4 will let you do 8,000 tokens. 3.5 will let you do 4,000. There's a version of 3.5 that lets you do 16,000. Now, you want to make sure you do this because if you have used the API, they're very quick to cut off your entire account. So you want to kind of self-regulate to make sure you're not hitting that edge, and you stop yourself from doing that. It's one of in their documentation. I did want to just clarification, because I've seen it in some of the other talks, is that with OpenAI, if you're using the API, they are not keeping any of that information for training their AI. It is entirely private from that point of view, that they are not keeping any of that data in there. So if you want to, use it for a company, I used it, we used it for a project and it went through legal review and it passed through a client. So you confidently say it, and you know that if you're using it for a client project with just their API, it'll go through a legal review as far as being used and not have that warning of it. Now, they do have some enterprise things, but you don't have to worry about getting to that level. As long as you're paying for their API access, you know that anything you use, it's private, and they're not using that to further train their models. Then we get to the actual, meats and potatoes of it. It's a fetch call. You put in the bearer token. And it's a JSON where I have put in just the data. This is something that you get for free that was usually something that kept you from deploying applications to end users very hard. If you put out something where you were expecting user input and there was always the risk of abuse, people type in whatever you wanted and when you got back, if you are using their API, as of right now, as far as I know, you get free access to their moderations API. Meaning that the last message, you send it in, they'll give you more detail, but at the least they'll give you a true or false, whether it has any sexual, violent, any of that thing, so you can just kind of kill you can handle it however you want to, but essentially it gives you that safety, that basis level safety for your application, and make sure that, you don't become that next trending thing of, I got the application to tell me to kill myself, or, before you get to that, before you get your product to say something bad, essentially, which is really awesome. And it was usually something that kept if you were building something, kept it out of there, or you had to train an entire other ML. And it can do sentiment analysis. I think once you start adding some of that, it becomes a paid, but same thing, it's pennies. It's not that bad. Now then we get into it, and same thing, as I mentioned before, the system prompts in there get back into a single array, and it doesn't care which order you put them in. You're giving them that system and user assignment, so it knows how to handle them. If you want to change model, all you have to change is the string. So you can honestly make it a drop down and change the type of model you're using and see what kind of responses you get. Messages go in there, and then the temperature. And then you can either do stream, and that means the response you get it as is being generated, and these are server events. Or if you set that to false, you just have to make sure that you're waiting for the minute or 2 minutes that it takes to generate the response, and you get that back in a single call. And then this just essentially checks for an error, because it can happen as any other application, and if not, it just sends it straight back to your application. So to whatever your front end or your mobile app. That's literally all the technical hardship of using the OpenAI of adding ChatGPT to your application. Like that is as hard as it is at a basis level. So really, what it comes down to it is what I had gone before is of thinking about the context that you're going to place it in and what you can, and how you are going to use it. So going back to here, and so this is the demo that I have, and kind of representing the multiple things that we talked about. The left side is kind of the parts that you don't see, the system prompts, and then the right side is the user prompts. And I just had some so these are the kind of things you do it. So it's like, hey, I'm a study buddy, and then you give it some things about how you can possibly respond. And then on the right side, oh, you know. And even with bad spelling, it's, yeah. And then you're good. So you can essentially have a conversation, and it's there. So and because I'm sending that back, see, every time that it's coming back, you can see how the context is adding to the tokens, and well, once it finishes, it'll recalculate. So suddenly, if I send it again, it'll be whatever this and 862, that'll be the cost of it. So this one cost in there. So see, that kind of becomes that simple. But now if I wanted to do, for example, create based on sports games, I give it some things. It's like, hey, these are the different types of, sports reporters that I want you to be. And then one of the things that becomes for, like I had mentioned, for the system that is really good is like you give it a sample of the type of data you're going to give it before, and then you show it. It's like, based on this information, this is the kind of answer that I want. So the more positive reinforcement and kind of negative context that you can give it, once you here, I have the same thing. I just have another game where I have the same type of stats, and I'm just telling it like, pick one of the random personalities, and let's say for example this one, I want it to be, instead of using the ChatGPT 3, I wanted to use 4. Now this one, as you can see, it's 2,000, so it's going to be a lot more. It's going to be more expensive. But I want this to be, more expressive or BSy in there. So One of the things I learned with if you're doing this in a Lambda or something, so if you're doing this in an application, it's sometimes better to, it's not intensive per se, but with Lambdas, because you're being charged per time, it's not as cost effective as, serverless. It's better to have just a server running that will, be that middle person for you. And it's not going to be a lot of instances. You can have a really tiny one and just literally act as that in between, because it's just taking that back and forth in between, but it needs to be up all of the time to just wait for a long time. Whereas with a serverless, you're paying for any query a minute, 2 minutes. If you're paying by the millisecond, that is going to add up very quickly and a lot more expensive. So see, like from that one, it just created So I am doing like essentially same endpoint, same UI. All I'm doing is I'm changing the system prompts that I'm giving to it, the context and the information that I'm giving to it, and it is suddenly an entirely different application, an entirely different context. So it's really about understanding. One of the benefits of you can create a lot of different personalities. You can kind of save them, iterate over them, and it becomes a lot more experimentation in trying it out, and almost a lot of being able to, the way you write to it, that's what prompt engineering ends up becoming. And that's where the...
What was the cost value on that one?
So... Let me get to that. I actually had this put up here. So for example, you guys have been here using it. 3.5 was 1 cent. It'll take a second to come up, but like even here yesterday I was testing. I did a lot of tests on 3.5 and then just a couple in 7, and it's just 7 cents. So the one query that we sent, because it was 2,000, it'll be about 7 or 8 cents for that one query. Because it is at the 3 to 4 cents per 1,000 tokens, and that was the 2,000 token thing plus the response. So that's where we get into the cost of that. There's not, for some more the verbal and things like that, you do get more in there, but for a lot of things, 3.5 is more than good enough. You get a lot more, you get things, and now with the 3.5 16K, you actually have a lot more expanse that you can do. These are in some 2 great resources if you want to do it. The second one was actually, it's actually a video course by a couple of OpenAI engineers. They're going to give you some of those basics of how to think about building your queries, what works, what doesn't. And then the first one is just a lot of resources about prompts and kind of the way to approach it. Everybody's trying out different things. People are putting it what works, what doesn't, but it's really a lot of trying and experimentation and going back and forth and getting consistency. Because you're going to send, one of the things that makes it a lot hard to understand when you're talking specifically to product people or other people, is that the same query every time is going to be different. This is something that's very different from all the other dev work that you do, is that it's almost like baking a cake. You have a whole bunch of ingredients, you're putting it in there, and you're throwing it into an oven, and when it comes out, it looks this way. Now, you may change something a little bit, but same thing, you're throwing it in the oven, and you don't know what is going to come out until the end. And it may work a little better, may not. And every time you bake it, even if you use the exact same thing, it's going to come out a little bit different. And they have to be okay with that level of risk, right? That's the risk. You can do some things on the other end and the UI at the end to kind of mitigate that, but that is inherent in anything that you do with AI specifically, like you're giving that. Now, seeing that I think we do have some time to get into a little bit of the further topics, if you wanted to tailor this a little bit more to your own data, to your own concepts, once you start getting further into that thing, you're gonna find out these two topics: fine-tuning and semantic searching. Fine-tuning is hard, and most of the time, you don't need it. The best way that I saw somebody, one of the things when I was trying to understand and trying to solve a problem and explaining, it's like, fine-tuning is if you have taught a child to tie knots, to tie their shoes, and you want to teach them to tie sailor knots, right? It is the same skill. You are just kind of nudging them and teaching them a little bit more of that skill. You're not going to suddenly teach them to start, building Legos. That's not what it is. Now, the risk of fine-tuning is that you are essentially opening up the model and you are retraining, you're adding training. So unless you are confident in like training your own model and knowing what you're doing, the risk is higher that you are going to mess up the model rather than improve it, because by that point, that's when you start needing to have thousands of images, doing the positive, doing the other things that you could, that you would do with your initial model, right? That's when you do it. Now, semantic searching, that's another thing that is really comes off from the ChatGPT API that makes it really unique. This is where their model essentially lets you convert a lot of data, a lot of documents into vectors, essentially into their own format, and then you can search or do searching through it very quickly. And this is kind of the best way that I found it. The embedding model, in the way that it works with, particularly with ChatGPT, it's another API, almost the same way we talked about it. Literally the same way it could work as just another API that you take if you have a catalog, you take each line of the CSV and you send it to it, and you get back a vector that it's an array of 1536 numbers long, and you don't need to know anything about it. You just store it on a database, something like Pinecone, and you just run all your data to it. Same thing, if you have all your documentation, you run it with some overlap so that in between, and you just run all of it through it. And that is sort of the like magic of the embedding model. It converts all of that into it. Then when you have a query, you run that query through the embedding model again, and then have Pinecone do a search to it, and it'll give you back some results, and it's there. The data is there. I implemented this for the Party City Party AI, where essentially we're planning a party and essentially ran their catalog through it, stored it there, and then we were asking it for a party, and it came back with a lot of with the products that then were given back as context to the original API, to the original query. It was just another message that we're doing. It's like, oh, use these products as part of your response in planning the party, and then you got the response. So that's essentially how it works. Like, you do the search, and then you get responses back. Now, that search could have been done entirely an old-fashioned way, going through in there. But what semantic search allows you to do is that suddenly you don't have to build an entire search engine. You don't have to build a comparison engine. It lets you do those kind of searches a lot for you. It's the same thing. It's a black box. Their model works now really well, and you can build it. But this depends on how you slice up that data and and that you are classifying that data in a way that the model understands. Same thing. It seems to work in a way that if it's almost the more human readable you're making those tables, like almost that CSV file or that data, the better the model can understand it. But if the data is bad from the beginning, then you're going to get bad results. But same thing, it makes it really easy to just run all your data through it. You pay for that run and then you store it. And then it's a database search that we do for anything, everywhere, a database search has become very common. So all of this, and that's the main thing that ChatGPT and OpenAI have done that's really changed from the Google and TensorFlow. Like TensorFlow and things like that were great, but there were a lot more. You had to understand machine learning, you had to create your own models, you had to do a lot more of the heavy lifting. Here they have made it, we have 2 APIs. If you know how to make REST end calls, as long as you understand how to use our APIs, go nuts, and there's a lot of stuff you can build on it. You're paying them for that, but it's not that exorbitant, and you are kind of bound to them for the time being, but it lets you prototype very quickly and do, and based on that. And this is just kind of a grand image. This is from one of the databases, kind of how it search. Essentially, it creates a multi-dimensional mode, and then when you search something else, it just kind of finds the closest dots to it. It's math. You don't have to worry about it. There's libraries. That's what LangChain does. It just has the math algorithm to it. If you want to keep going crazy, you want to find better math for finding the closest vectors, you can keep optimizing into it. There's nothing stopping you to it, or you can use libraries that kind of have some of those things built out for you. Same thing, OpenAI has built out node packages that have some of these, like what I went through the steps, they've made it into a single node call, but same thing, like splitting packages, they keep updating it, they change the names. In the repo that I showed, I'm using it, but I'm only using it for the TypeScript types because they keep changing, they keep updating it. But I just wanted to kind of break it down into a common fetch call to show just how simple it is, and to, if people were not using a particular node or something like that, if they were using another language, they could use it. And that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, Twitter, and I'm trying out some of the other ones. I'm not really active in there. That's where I have kind of my blogs. I just put up, hopefully should be up, this presentation slides if you want to go up there, next steps. I do run the React Atlanta meetup. If you are local, please come up. We're getting that more in person. If you have any ideas or you want to try your hand in speaking, come in there. Same thing, if you want to get more involved. This QR code is, we started a Discord for all the local dev meetups, Vue.js, Atlanta JavaScript, Flutter ATL, and Google developers, where essentially you only have one place you need to check about events coming up, and you're not having to kind of track in there. So, this should get you signed up. So please come in and join us. And yeah, if you have any questions, happy to answer them. Yeah.
When you're sending system and user context, are the tokens weighted any differently? Like, is 10 words of system?
No.
They're
They're
the same. Okay.
the same. It's all broken down into it's almost like syllables. A syllable is a token. It's about the best way to think about it. Yeah. And their response is also in there. So yeah, everything gets added, gets computed into that. Yeah.
When you're hosting your own vector database, does it use just that, or can you use that in combination with the big one?
You can use, so the vector database is just, it's honestly, you can store it however you want. Pinecone right now is one that's been made specifically for it, but you can store it in Postgres. Like LangChain specifically has a plugin to pull from Postgres, but you can store it on whatever you want. With the API, you're essentially sending it, and you get, you send it some data, you get a vector back, and you do, as a developer, you do with it whatever you want. It's up to you how you want to store it. Pinecone is just specifically built for consuming that right now faster and handling that use case, but there's nothing specific about it that is, as far as I know and as far as I've used it, there's nothing unique about it.
That's only got the data that you put in there, right?
Yes.
You don't have the big model that OpenAI hosts.
No.
Are you able to use a combination of the two with your chatbot client?
Yes. So the way that works is that the vector is for you to get answer for your own content. So essentially, if I wanted to get specific knowledge about say you have your documentation, right? And I need to ask it about an answer for my question, I would send that to the embedding, and then the vectors would give me the closest parts of it where it might be that response, and then the vectors would give me the original text. So it stores the original text and then the vector. The vector is used for responding the query, and then you have the original text. You take that original text and you send that to your original OpenAI, like your original chatbot, your original OpenAI call, right? So you tell it like, use this bit of information as extra context to answer the question. So, like middleware. Yeah, it's sort of like an extra step of, instead of you having to, if I was building I guess here, let me go, like the demo, it would be the same. Of me adding this. It's like an automatic way of me creating this thing here. Like of me doing like, if I get this, if I have this question, like this is the response. So use this extra response to build your thing. Like use this data to answer your query. And that's how you built your, when you're building kind of your personality, you would build it. You would be like, hey, this is some extra information that I want you to base your response on. So be like, this chapter of your documentation is what has the information that then the ChatGPT would need to answer the question. So that's the searching part of it. So the vector kind of finds it in there. It doesn't really know it, and then it brings back the original text, and then you plop that back into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT then does its part of reading the extra information you gave it to then create the response. Can you be a little louder?
If those vectors are long sequences of numbers, are those are they ChatGPT specific, or are they in any way standardized? I mean, can I, for example, generate similar ones using, say, local AI and then pass it to ChatGPT?
So yes, the question that he said was, are those numbers specifically to ChatGPT? And yes, they are specific to that model, and I think there's so much they're even specific to that particular version of the model. So it would even be the case, and you have to keep an eye on it, that if they released an update to the model, which they tend to do, and they're fairly good about notifying it, you would have to rerun it and re-update your vectors. I think overall they're kind of good about kind of notifying and keeping, not breaking it, but they would become less and less relevant. But yes, the vectors are relevant to that model understanding it. Now, because it is math and you're in there, they're still going to be relevant to each other. Where you're going to be able to hit a problem is that when you create a query, because you're running the query through the model, it's going to be in a different space, if that makes sense. So what makes all of this work is that you're running everything through the same model. It puts the results in in the same sort of mathematical space. Let me go back. Right, if you're thinking about it, like all of the things you're putting in this like three-dimensional space, and the points and the vectors are creating this math space in there. When you run your query, it's also creating a point in that same space. And then you're getting the responses of the closest points around it. So whatever model you use to create the original points needs to be the same model that you use to run the query to make sure that they're relevant and you can get a good response. Otherwise, that the vectors are not going to be meaningful to each other. Does that make sense?
And also the dimensionality of vectors depends on the model. So ChatGPT has 1536.
Yes. So he's saying the dimensionality is depending on the model. Yes. And I think this is something like when you're doing searches, depending on how complicated it is, you do more or less. ChatGPT shows that many parameters to make their model. That's something I've learned just recently, apparently, of semantic. Even semantic search seems to be like the Google Open Search or something runs on something similar to that. But yeah, so it's just how they created in their responses, and you're just kind of storing it to run it later on, so to be performant. But yeah, and I think are we out of time or? Good. Okay. All right. So I think that's everything. Yeah. Thank you so much.